7 days from now, the countdown that has been hitting Canadian cars is about to hit something a lot closer to your kitchen counter. On August 19th, at 1 minute past midnight, a 50% tariff lands on Canadian beer, wine, cider, and spirits entering the United States. That means whiskey, brandy, rum, gin, vodka, and liqueurs, all 50% more expensive to import starting that exact moment. And unlike some of the other tariffs you have heard about this year, this one comes with no exemption at all for products that would otherwise qualify under the free trade agreement between these two countries. This is not a rumor circulating on social media. On July 20th, President Trump signed a formal proclamation under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, the same rarely used law behind the tariffs already announced on Canadian vehicles and Canadian dairy. Section 338 gives the president authority to impose tariffs up to 50% on any country found to discriminate against American commerce, and it had barely been used at this scale in nearly a century before this year. Alcohol is the third category in that same set of proclamations, and it is arguably the most personal one, because this is not an industrial input sitting in a warehouse somewhere. This is the bottle sitting on the shelf of your local liquor store right now. Before this specific proclamation, Canada was not a minor supplier of whiskey to American shelves. As recently as 2021, Canada was the single largest source of imported whiskey in the entire United States, shipping more than 106 million liters in that year alone, according to industry trade data compiled by the Distilled Spirits Council. Brands like Crown Royal, Canadian Club, and Pendleton have sat on liquor store shelves in nearly every American state for decades, coast to coast. This was never a niche import category. It was one of the largest and most consistent cross-border trade relationships in the entire American beverage industry. Before we get into what this actually costs you, you need to understand why this tariff exists in the first place, because the backstory here is more dramatic than most people realize. Subscribe to Power Map, because we are going to walk through exactly how a fight over exports turned into a fight over the whiskey in your cabinet, and why the countdown to August 19th matters more than most people watching this understand. Here is where it starts. Back in March of 2025, in direct response to the first wave of Trump's tariffs, Canadian provinces did something almost nobody outside the beverage industry noticed at the time. Provincial liquor boards in Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and several other provinces were directed to stop purchasing American alcohol entirely. Existing American products were pulled off shelves. They were removed from digital ordering platforms. In most of the country, if you walked into a government-run liquor store in Canada looking for a bottle of American bourbon or a case of American beer, you simply could not buy one anymore. Only 2 provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, have lifted that ban since it went into effect. The damage that did to American alcohol producers was enormous, and the numbers are not vague estimates. American wine exports to Canada collapsed from $460 million down to just $103 million. American distilled spirits exports fell from $238 million down to $89 million. American beer exports dropped from $47 million down to just $17 million. Put those 3 categories together, and you are looking at a market that shrank by roughly 70% in about a year. The White House's own proclamation puts the broader collapse in Canadian purchases of American alcoholic beverages at 81% between March of 2025 and February of 2026. To put that in context, Canada was not a minor export destination for American alcohol before this happened. It was the single largest export market in the world for American spirits, and one of the most valuable destinations anywhere for American wine and American beer. An entire slice of the American beverage industry built years of business planning around Canadian demand, and in the space of about 11 months, most of that demand simply vanished because of a provincial policy decision made in response to a trade dispute that had nothing to do with alcohol in the first place. So now you understand the trigger. The Trump administration's position is that Canada's alcohol boycott amounts to exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment that Section 338 was written to address, the same justification used for the vehicle and dairy tariffs. Whether or not you think that response is proportionate, the mechanism is now moving forward regardless, and August 19th is the date it becomes real. Now let's talk about what actually shows up on shelves in the United States, because this is where the tariff stops being an abstract trade statistic and starts being a specific bottle you might already have in your house. Crown Royal, one of the best-selling whiskey brands in North America, is a Canadian product owned by the spirits giant Diageo. Fireball, the cinnamon whiskey that shows up behind nearly every American bar, traces its roots to Canadian production under Sazerac. Canadian Club, one of the oldest and most recognizable whiskey brands on liquor store shelves, is still made in Walkerville, Ontario, even though it is owned today by the Japanese conglomerate Suntory. 40 Creek, a smaller but well-regarded Canadian whiskey brand, is owned by the Italian spirits company Campari. J.P. Wiser's, another major Canadian whiskey label with deep roots going back to the 1850s, is owned by Pernod Ricard. And on the beer side, Molson and Labatt, two of the most recognized Canadian beer brands in American border states and beyond, ship enormous volumes south of the border every single year. There is a detail buried in that brand list that most coverage of this tariff completely skips over, and it changes how you should think about who actually absorbs this cost. Almost none of these brands are still owned by small independent Canadian companies. Crown Royal belongs to the British spirits giant Diageo. Fireball is controlled by the American company Sazerac. Canadian Club is owned by the Japanese conglomerate Suntory. 40 Creek belongs to the Italian company Campari. J.P. Wiser's is owned by the French company Pernod Ricard. What gets sold to you as a distinctly Canadian product is, in nearly every major case, one small line item inside a massive multinational portfolio. That matters because it means the 50% tariff is not primarily squeezing small distilleries in small Canadian towns. It is squeezing the Canadian production arm of some of the largest beverage conglomerates on earth, companies with the size and the pricing power to decide how much of that new cost gets absorbed internally and how much gets passed straight through to you at checkout. None of these are obscure imports sitting in a specialty shop. These are mainstream, high-volume, instantly recognizable products sitting in the well of practically every American bar and on the middle shelf of practically every American liquor store. When you put a 50% tariff on all of them at once, you are not creating a niche pricing adjustment. You are touching one of the most visible, most frequently purchased categories of product that crosses this particular border. So what does 50% actually translate to in dollars? Trade analysts covering the beverage industry have used a simple wholesale example to illustrate the math. Take a bottle that costs $15 at the wholesale level when it crosses the border. Under the earlier 25% tariff scenario that was being discussed before this escalation, that would add $3.75 to the wholesale cost of that bottle. At 50%, that impact roughly doubles, pushing the added wholesale cost towards $7.50 on that same $15 bottle. And that number is only the wholesale layer. American alcohol distribution runs through what is called the three-tier system, producer to distributor to retailer, with a markup applied at each stage. A tariff increase at the very first step of that chain does not stay flat as it moves through the other two. It compounds. Trade press covering this story has already reported that Crown Royal specifically is facing meaningful price increases tied to this tariff escalation, and industry analysts expect similar increases to hit other major Canadian whiskey brands as the August 19th deadline approaches. Beer follows a slightly different pattern worth understanding, because not every Canadian labeled brand carries the same exposure. Molson Coors, one of the largest beer companies operating across both countries, brews its major American labels, Coors Light and Miller Lite, inside Canadian breweries specifically for sale within Canada, separate from the Molson Canadian and Labatt products that actually cross the border into the United States as imports. That structural detail matters here because domestically brewed product sold inside Canada for Canadian consumption is not the same thing as an imported case of Molson Canadian or Labatt Blue sitting on an American shelf. The tariff hits the actual cross-border shipment, not everything wearing a Canadian label on a beer aisle. Here is the part of this story that almost nobody talking about the tariff itself has connected yet. While American liquor is being pulled off Canadian shelves, Canadian whiskey brands have been thriving inside their own domestic market as a direct result. With bourbon and other American spirits unavailable in most Canadian liquor stores, Canadian drinkers have been turning to homegrown alternatives with similar flavor profiles. J.P. Wiser's and 40 Creek, both corn-heavy Canadian whiskeys that share flavor characteristics with American bourbon, have reported strong growth inside Canada, specifically because their usual American competition has been removed from the shelf entirely. One Canadian distillery has publicly described the shift inside the domestic market as immense growth directly tied to the disappearance of American alcohol from Canadian retail. So think about the position this puts those same brands in now. J.P. Wiser's and 40 Creek are winning inside Canada because American products got pulled from Canadian shelves. At the same time, both of those brands, along with Crown Royal, Canadian Club, and the rest of the Canadian whiskey industry, are about to get hit with a 50% tariff trying to sell into the American market. One country's domestic protection is happening at the exact same moment as the other country's punitive tariff, and both are landing on the same handful of companies simultaneously. This is where the American side of this story gets complicated in a way that should concern anyone who assumed a tariff automatically helps the country imposing it. The American spirits industry, representing the same producers who watched their Canadian export market collapse by 70% over the past year, has publicly pushed back against this new 50% tariff on Canadian alcohol. Their argument is not that Canada should be let off the hook. Their argument is that escalating further deepens an already damaging trade standoff and increases the risk of additional retaliation, rather than restoring the market access American producers actually want back. Industry warnings point to a real and immediate risk, canceled orders, and rising unsold inventory for American distillers who are still trying to do business with Canadian partners while this entire dispute plays out. Read that carefully, because it is the most important twist in this entire story. The industry that has already been hurt the most by this trade fight, American wine, beer, and spirits producers who lost roughly 70% of their Canadian export market in less than a year, is now warning that the government's own retaliation could make their situation worse, not better. They are not cheering this tariff on. They are asking Washington to negotiate a restoration of market access, instead of adding another punitive measure into an already spiraling dispute. Let's zoom out and look at the full shape of what is happening here, because it says something important about how trade wars actually work once they start moving. Canada's provinces banned American alcohol first, in direct response to the initial round of Trump tariffs on other goods. That ban devastated American wine, beer, and spirits exports to Canada. Washington then responded not by targeting Canada's alcohol boycott directly with a policy aimed at reopening those provincial liquor markets, but by placing a 50% tariff on the very same category of goods coming the other direction, Canadian alcohol entering the United States. Each side's retaliation lands on the same industry, and neither move so far has actually restored the market access that started this entire chain reaction. That is the trap sitting underneath every headline about this tariff. A 50% tariff on Canadian alcohol does not put a single bottle of American bourbon back on a Canadian liquor store shelf. It does not reopen the Ontario or Quebec Liquor Board purchasing lists. It simply adds another cost on another category layered on top of a trade relationship that was already breaking down before this specific proclamation was even signed. It is worth comparing this directly to the vehicle side of the same set of proclamations, because the two stories share a deadline but not much else. The vehicle tariff exists because Canada imposed retaliatory duties on American-built cars after the first round of Trump tariffs, and Canadian demand for American vehicles dropped by roughly 22% as a result. The alcohol tariff exists because Canadian provinces pulled American alcohol off store shelves entirely, and American exports collapsed by closer to 70 or 80% depending on the category. The alcohol boycott did more proportional damage to American producers than the vehicle retaliation did, which is part of why the administration singled it out for its own dedicated proclamation, rather than folding it into a broader category. Both fights share the same August 19th deadline. Both fights share the same legal mechanism under Section 338. But the alcohol dispute started from a deeper wound, and that context matters when you are trying to judge how likely either side is to back down before the clock runs out. Now, here is where the countdown becomes relevant again, because there is still a window before this becomes permanent. Just like the vehicle tariff set to take effect the same day, this alcohol tariff has a hard deadline and an open door for negotiation before that deadline arrives. Canadian and American negotiators are working against the same August 19th clock across every category covered by these three proclamations: vehicles, dairy, and alcohol together. If a deal is reached before midnight on the 19th, this specific tariff could be delayed, adjusted, or scrapped entirely before it ever shows up on an invoice. If no deal is reached, it becomes automatic and binding at 1 minute past midnight, exactly like the vehicle tariff, with no grace period and no phase-in. Political pressure inside Canada on this issue mirrors what is happening on the auto tariff front as well. Provincial leaders who pushed for the original alcohol boycott are not eager to reverse course quickly, especially with domestic Canadian whiskey brands currently benefiting from the reduced competition on their own shelves. Several provincial premiers have publicly pushed back against reopening their markets to American alcohol, even as this new 50% tariff escalates the standoff, treating the boycott as leverage they are not willing to give up cheaply. Meanwhile, federal negotiators in Ottawa are working to find some path back to a functioning trade relationship before more categories of goods get pulled into this same 50% tariff structure. That tension between provincial politics and federal negotiation strategy has already shown up clearly on the auto tariff side of this story, and alcohol appears to be following the exact same pattern: provinces holding firm, the federal government trying to negotiate a broader resolution, and a deadline that does not wait for either side to fully align. Think about what each outcome actually looks like on the ground, because both are concrete, not abstract. If negotiators reach a deal before midnight on the 19th, the most likely result is some form of phased reopening, American alcohol gradually returning to Canadian shelves in exchange for this new tariff being delayed, reduced, or dropped entirely before distributors ever see the higher invoice. If no deal is reached, American retailers and bars start receiving Canadian shipments at 50% higher wholesale cost almost immediately, and importers will have to decide in real time whether to eat that cost, raise shelf prices, or in the most extreme cases, stop reordering certain lower margin Canadian products altogether. That last scenario, a distributor quietly deciding a specific Canadian brand is no longer worth the margin at the new tariff rate, is exactly the kind of quiet inventory contraction the American spirits industry has already warned about, and it would not necessarily show up as a dramatic price sticker change. It could just as easily show up as certain bottles slowly disappearing from certain shelves over the following months. Let's put every number from this story in one place, because together they show you exactly how large this has already become before the new tariff has even taken effect. $460 million American wine exports to Canada before the boycott, $103 million American wine exports to Canada after it, $238 million American spirits exports to Canada before the boycott, $89 million American spirits exports to Canada after it, $47 million American beer exports to Canada before the boycott, $17 million American beer exports to Canada after it, 81%, the overall collapse in Canadian purchases of American alcohol cited in the White House's own proclamation. 50%, the new tariff rate landing on Canadian beer, wine, cider, and spirits entering the United States on August 19th. 0, the number of USMCA exemptions built into this specific tariff. And 7, the number of days left before it becomes binding at 1 minute past midnight. What all of this adds up to is a trade relationship where alcohol has become one of the clearest casualties on both sides of the border at once. American producers lost the largest export market they had for spirits almost overnight. Canadian producers are about to lose meaningful access to the American market at exactly the moment their own domestic sales are climbing because of the very policy that started this fight. Nobody in this specific corner of the trade war is winning right now. Everyone is absorbing damage while the clock ticks down toward a deadline that either resolves this or locks it in. And unlike a car purchase, which most families make once every several years, alcohol is a category people buy every single week. A tariff on vehicles shows up on a handful of transactions spread across a household's entire year. A tariff on beer, wine, and spirits shows up practically every time someone walks down that aisle, which means the political and consumer pressure building around this specific proclamation may end up moving faster and louder than the vehicle side of this same trade dispute ever does. Bars and restaurants face a version of this squeeze that looks a little different from what happens on a retail shelf. A liquor store can simply raise its posted price the week new inventory arrives at the higher tariff cost. A bar usually cannot reprice a drink menu that quickly without frustrating regular customers, which means many bar owners absorb the higher wholesale cost for weeks or months before menu prices catch up, quietly eating thinner margins on every Fireball shot and every Crown Royal pour in the meantime. Fireball in particular is one of the highest volume well liquors poured behind American bars, which means this specific tariff reaches into nightly bar margins in a way that a vehicle tariff simply never does. If you have a bottle of Crown Royal, Canadian Club, or Fireball in your cabinet right now, you are looking at a product that could cost meaningfully more within days if this tariff takes effect as written, and one that industry groups on both sides of the border are actively lobbying to avoid. If you want to see how this resolves before August 19th, whether a deal reopens Canadian liquor shelves to American producers or this 50% tariff becomes permanent on the way in the other direction, that is exactly the kind of story we track here. Subscribe to Power Map so you catch the outcome the moment it happens, not weeks later after the price on the shelf has already changed. Drop a comment and tell me this. Do you think this alcohol tariff gets negotiated away before the deadline? Or does it become the new normal for Canadian beer, wine, and spirits crossing into the United States? 7 days left to find out.